Okay, it's time to start. So welcome everybody to this session about architecture of custom Microsoft 365 solutions. I'm Paolo Pialorsi, working as a senior consultant in psys.com, a company of my own. And here you can see my Twitter ID in case you want to follow me on Twitter. First of all, before moving to the content of the session, I want to remind you that next year, March 23rd to 25th, 2021, there will be the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. So mark it on your agenda and be there because it will be one of the best events about Microsoft 365. Thanks to our sponsor, of course, because this kind of events can be possible just because of the support that we get from our sponsor. And let me introduce myself very briefly before moving to the actual content of the session. I'm Paolo, I'm from Italy, 44 years old. I'm a senior consultant, as I said, working in a company of my own, psys.com, which is based both in Italy and in the US. I'm a husband and a father of 3 marvelous kids and the author of 11 books so far. I'm fully focused on Microsoft 365 and SharePoint Online migration and adoption projects from a developer point of view. So whenever there is a custom development in place, I'm involved in the architecting of the solution and in the design of the migration or adoption in a customer site. I'm based in a town called Brescia. I speak Italian and I try to do my best to speak English as well. So remember that you can have a chance to win an Oculus Quest. There will be a raffle, so keep into account, follow the instructions on the slide, and follow the link that you see on this slide to try to win one geeky gift. Moreover, this is a really tough period, we all know, and if you want to donate, please feel free to do that and keep into account that the 10% of the funds that we are collecting for this conference will be donated to a charity. Here you have a QR code to provide feedback about my session and about the whole event. Keep it into your mind and use it at the end of the session to give us your feedback. So, what are the topics that we are going to cover today in this 50-minute session? First of all, I want to explain you why we should think about architecting a Microsoft 365 custom developed solution. And I will try to share with you what are the out-of-the-box services and the tools available in Microsoft 365 that you can leverage to build custom developed solutions, together with some of the useful services that you have in Microsoft Azure to build your own custom developed solutions. At the very end of the session, I will also give you an idea of a real solution and of the architecture of a real solution that I've been working on in the last 18 months almost, which is the Microsoft Lookbook site. I want to be completely clear. In this session, I'm going to share my own experience and my own ideas built on the fields, working while architecting and developing solutions built on top of Microsoft 365. So I'm sharing my own opinions and ideas. Maybe you will agree, maybe not. I'm open to feedback, but the goal of this session is to have a discussion about the available options and about how you should define the architecture of your own custom developed solutions. There will be no demos in this session, but it will be just a discussion about the options, the challenges, and when you should use what, regardless of the whole goal that you have to achieve. So, first of all, why would you build a solution, a custom solution based on Microsoft 365? Well, the overall idea is that Microsoft 365 is a very rich set of services that you can use and which are available out of the box in any tenant. Let me, for example, talk about Azure Active Directory, which is really useful for identity management, authentication, and authorization in your solutions, or Exchange Online if you want to work with email, calendar, contacts, and stuff like that. The same applies for SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business when you need to work with documents and files, with Microsoft Teams when you want to think about chats, channel, communication with users and stuff like that, and so on and so forth. There's plenty of services out of the box available and ready for you to use and to provide to your end users. Very often, a custom solutions needs to rely on this kind of functionality. So you need to send emails, you need to create meetings, you need to manage documents, you need, of course, to authenticate and authorize users. And as such, Microsoft 365 is a very, very good basis on top of which you can build actual solutions, not only because you want to use the out-of-the-box offering of the Office 365 and Microsoft 365 ecosystem, but because you want to build your own custom developed solutions on top of it. So the basic idea is that instead of reinventing the wheel, you should start thinking about what you can reuse and what is already available in Microsoft 365 before creating custom code. Just to give you an idea, in the last few years, I've been working on quite a rich variety of solutions built on top of Microsoft 365. And just to give you an idea, process automation solutions to manage document management, approval workflows, sites to manage HR or HSE procedures, research and development processes and stuff like that. Also, automated provisioning solutions are solutions that I have been working quite a lot in the last few years. You can provision sites in SharePoint Online. You can provision teams in Microsoft Teams. You can provision both of them. So sites and teams all together in a unique provisioning solutions. You can provision page templates for SharePoint Online, for example. And whenever you create a provisioning solution, you should keep into account also that generally speaking, you not only need to provision content or artifacts on the target infrastructure, but you will also need to maintain, to update those provisioned artifacts, as well as eventually provide functionalities to do the decommissioning of those artifacts. And again, quite often we need to build solutions to integrate with line of business systems. So like, for example, purchase order integration systems, customers or suppliers sign up or registration solutions, quality assurance solutions, and stuff like that. So all these kind of solutions can benefit from a backend based on Microsoft 365 and can be built on top of the out-of-the-box offering of Microsoft 365. Whenever we do that, there are some challenges that we need to face. There are scalability and availability challenges, security in the fields of authorization and authentication. We need to make the right choice when we define the UI elements, the business logic in the backend, how we host those solutions, how we handle the deployment of the solution from a multiple environment point of view. So when you need to provide a dev, test, staging, and production environment, both in your development platform as well as from a Microsoft 365 tenant point of view. You need to think carefully about the content repository for your content, how to do monitoring and telemetry, and how to maintain your solution. And these are the main challenges that I want to discuss with you in the upcoming minutes. So start talking about the availability and scalability, high availability and scalability. The key topics are the persistent storage, how you write your custom code, how you make your solution truly asynchronous, and how you can leverage caching to improve performances. So let's start thinking about persistence and the persistent storage in your solution. If you're architecting a solution on top of Microsoft 365, you have multiple options available. First of all, you need to ask yourself a question. Where should I store my data? Well, my answer is try to keep your data as close as you can. So you shouldn't have some data on one side and some other data on another side, because otherwise you will pay a lot in terms of bandwidth and network traffic in order to being able to collect all of the information. So based on the kind of data that you want to store, try to store your data as close as you can to all of the other services that you have. And for example, if you need to store items objects, collection of information, which is, for example, fully structured and relational, you should consider using a repository like an Azure SQL database so that you can stay on the cloud, eventually in a data center close to the data center where you host your Microsoft 365 solution. And I would advise you to consider using Entity Framework to access your data layer, your data persistence layer, because this will improve the maintainability of your code as well as the readability of your code. If you are going to persist non-relational data, of course, you should consider using a polyglot system, like, for example, the Azure Cosmos DB. There are also the SharePoint lists available to store items, and they are available out of the box in Microsoft 365. However, depending on the size of the information, on the number of items that you need to store, you should carefully consider using a SharePoint list for storing objects and items for your custom developed solution. In fact, in SharePoint Online lists, you could have lower performances compared to an Azure SQL database or an Azure Cosmos DB. You could have the list view threshold challenges to face. And whenever you want to query that kind of data, you will have to use camel queries or Open Data Protocol if you want to use REST. So your life will be a little bit more complex compared with a classic database, relational or polyglot database access. At the same time, you should start thinking about the fact that Microsoft is going to release the new Microsoft List service. So maybe when it will be released, that one will be another suitable option available out of the box in Microsoft 365. And what if you want to store documents and files? Well, of course, in Microsoft 365, we have SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business. We will come back to this topic later, but when you use SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, you can easily store documents in the infrastructure provided by Microsoft 365, and you can read those content, those files using the Microsoft Graph or eventually the REST APIs of SharePoint Online. Again, I'm going to advise you that you should be careful using the client-side object model for SharePoint in the architecture of your solution, because that one, right now at least, is still targeting .NET Framework and not .NET Standard or .NET Core. As such, you can't use CSOM in an Azure Function v2 or v3, or you cannot use CSOM in a containerized solution. So my advice is to try to use Microsoft Graph as your first option, or SharePoint REST API as the second option. And maybe in the future, if CSOM for .NET Standard will be available, you can consider using that one as well. From a custom code development point of view, well, I'm a developer. Everybody knows me as a developer, but I think I'm a responsible developer. So you should try to avoid writing custom code as much as you can in your solution. And you should try to reuse or do your best to reuse the services available out of the box in Microsoft 365 and in Microsoft Azure. However, if you really need to do something which really needs to write custom code, you need to be careful. You need to keep into account that as Microsoft 365 and Azure are highly scalable and highly available, your custom code should be highly available and highly scalable as well. So when you write your custom code, keep into account that you have to make it asynchronous. You have to make it repeatable so that in case of any issue, you can repeat the request without having any side effect on your persistent data or on your business logic. As such, your solution should be idempotent. You should be able to write code which is easily monitorable so that you can measure the performance and the availability of your solution. And of course, you need to keep into account that a cloud-based solution has to be maintainable on the go. I mean that whenever you have to release an update, you should not have a down of your system just because you need to update the binaries. So we'll see shortly how you can do that, but using Azure and using what is provided by the Microsoft 365 system, you can easily achieve this goal of having a maintainable on-the-go custom developed solution. Again, thinking about custom code, you should try to keep the UI as lightweight as you can, and you should use the UI just to collect information from the user and to validate information provided by the users. But you will need to have, that's my advice again, a backend infrastructure of microservices hosted, for example, on Azure. And in order to reach those backend services, those backend microservices, you have some available options. First of all, and always, you need to keep into account that you have to use an asynchronous model to reach those backend services. And those backend services can be, for example, Azure Functions, eventually durable Azure Functions, can be Azure Blob Storage Queue or Azure Service Bus queues. And I will explain you in a bit what is the difference between these available options and when you should use what. But first of all, let me give you an idea with some architectural diagrams of what I mean when I say use an asynchronous model to reach your backend services and use any of the options that I highlighted in the previous slide. So let's assume that we have a web-based UI or a native application hosted on a mobile device or on a desktop environment, and that we want to do something in the backend targeting Microsoft 365. Like creating a meeting, like uploading the document in a document library in SharePoint, or writing or reading information in a team channel or stuff like that. Well, the front-end UI should rely on an Azure function, which eventually could be a durable function and could use an HTTP endpoint, an HTTP activation model for the backend function, so that you can just fire and forget the request that you send to the backend Azure function. That Azure function will then rely on eventually many other functions with the durable function stateful model. Another option that you have, which is more asynchronous than the previous one, is based on a storage queue in the middle. So again, your front end will just store a request in a queue, in a blob storage queue. And in the back end, again, there will be a job or a function which will dequeue your message from the queue and will process the request. And the function, again, could be a durable function if you like. In the back end, the function will do the actual job, working and talking with the APIs through Microsoft Graph, for example, provided by Microsoft 365. The same architecture applies for the service bus queue, so it looks exactly the same, but there are some small differences that I'm going to highlight to let you make the right choice depending on your requirements. So first of all, you should consider using an Azure function if an HTTP activated endpoint is enough for you. If the activity is really simple and short in time, so you can use a fire and forget model, or you can eventually wait for a reply back from the Azure function, but as such, the request will not be fully asynchronous. If you don't need to have any retry logic, or if you can rely on something like, for example, Power Automate flows or Logic App flows, that will invoke the backend Azure function. And as I said, you should consider using a durable Azure function if you need to have a stateful infrastructure based on multiple functions in a chain, keeping a serverless compute model, but with a stateful approach. You should consider using a blob storage queue. On the contrary, if you have more business critical tasks, but which can rely on a asynchronous infrastructure, which will just wake up a job or a function in the back end of the queue, and which can eventually leverage a poison queue in case of any failure, so that you can later on analyze the messages in the poison queue and eventually reprocess those messages. And that's why I was talking about having a custom developed solution, which is idempotent, because you should be able to reprocess the same message multiple times without having a real impact onto the backend persistent storage and logic. With an Azure Blob Storage Queue, you can easily have a retry logic, which is out of the box available in the job SDK, for example, if you are using a web job. But you should keep into account that when you have, for example, an Azure web job or an Azure function processing a message in a Blob Storage Queue, in case you need to update the backend logic, there is no way to easily suspend the queue while you are upgrading the system. On the contrary, with the Azure Service Bus, you can have a better resulting performance because it is more scalable, more highly available compared with the Blob storage queue. So you can, at the very end, provide a better SLA to your customers. And at the same time, if you need to do maintenance, if you need to upgrade the binaries processing your messages in the queue, using the Azure Service Bus, you can easily put your queue on suspend, so you can still collect messages, but you will not have the job listening for those messages. You can update the job, the function, or whatever else, and then you can restart listening for the messages, and you will not lose anything in the queue in the meantime. So from a maintenance point of view, the service bus is way better than a Blob storage queue, in my opinion. That said, when you think about caching, well, as I always say, the best way to execute code is not to execute it. So use caching if you can. Cache whatever you can so that you don't need to process the information to provide it to the user. You can use the Azure Redis cache if you like to store object or generic information across multiple processes running in your cloud-based infrastructure. And you should consider using the Azure Blob storage again for storing blob and binaries that you can eventually provide through a CDN, CAN, a content delivery network to your users. But you can also consider using SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business again for storing files that you want to share with users and that you can generate once on the fly and store in a persistent repository like a library, and you can eventually also convert into a specific format, like for example a PDF using the Microsoft Graph. From a security point of view, whenever we think about a Microsoft 365 solution, Azure Active Directory is in place. Azure Active Directory is the main infrastructural service of any Microsoft 365 solution. In Azure Active Directory, we store users, roles, applications, and permissions. Whenever you create a solution, you should always register that solution at least as one app, one application in Azure Active Directory, maybe more than one. For example, you could have a front-end application which is registered in Azure Active Directory and which will leverage the delegated access token to behave on behalf of the currently connected user. And you should consider registering backend apps still in Azure Active Directory, which will rely on Microsoft Graph and all of the backend services. And eventually, you can leverage the on behalf flow so that you can authenticate the user on the front end. You can move the delegated access token of that user to the backend, and using the on behalf flow, you can have the request executed and running in the backend, executed and run on behalf of the user, which is connected on the front end. Whenever you register a solution in Azure Active Directory, you always have to make a choice between having a single or a multi-tenant solution. Just to make it simple, just for the sake of simplicity, I would say my general rule is, if you are building a solution for a single company, for your own company, and as such, most likely for a single tenant, that will be a single tenant solution. If you are building a solution that you want to provide or to sell to multiple customers, that will be a multi-tenant solution. Multi-tenant solution is quite easy from a maintenance point of view because you will have a unique application registered in your own unique tenant, and then you will share all of the settings, all of the permission requests, and all of the information stored in the manifest of your application that you register in your own Azure Active Directory across all of the tenants that will accept to register your multi-tenant solution in their tenant too. Whenever you use Azure Active Directory to register your applications, of course, OAuth, Open Authorization, is your best friend. It's your best friend because you use Open Authorizations to get access token to access the backend services, whether they are the out-of-the-box services provided by the workloads of Microsoft 365, or if they are custom services, custom backend services of your own that you created and registered in the tenant. If you need to run your solutions with an app-only model in the backend, please consider using an X509 certificate for authenticating your application rather than the client ID and the share secret in order to have a better security with the X509 certificate. Whenever you configure your solution from an open authorization perspective, you have to configure and to grant the permission scopes that you need. And of course, for a front-end application, you should assign and grant delegated permissions. So those permissions which are granted to the application in order to behave on behalf of the connected user. On the contrary, if you are building a backend solution, you should think about registering and granting application permissions. And as such, you can build, for example, Azure Functions running in the backend again, PowerShell scripts, web jobs, or backend processes and services, which will work with an application as service principal accounts. And as I said, keep into account that Azure Active Directory supports the on-behalf flow. So you can authenticate the user in the front end, you can transfer the delegated access token invoking a backend API of your own, and that backend API will be able to invoke in the backend again, Microsoft 365 or any other API of your own using an on-behalf delegated access token, so on behalf of the user in the front end. This is a really, really powerful scenario in my opinion. And what if you need to safely store information? Sorry, you can consider using the Azure Key Vault service, which is yet another really powerful service that you have in Microsoft Azure, and which is really useful whenever you need to store tokens, passwords. So for example, if you need to store the token to access a specific resource or a X509 certificate that you want to use to access with an app-only model, a backend API or stuff like that. You can also use Azure Key Vault to safely store the settings of your applications, as well as you can store all the sensitive information using the Key Vault service. Whenever you create a solution relying on the Azure Key Vault service, you should keep into account some, let me say, information. Okay, so first of all, the Azure Key Vault service, as almost any other cloud-based service, will have some throttling rules. And does have some throttling rules. So you need to be careful, and whenever you consume the Azure Key Vault, you should keep into account that you could get throttled while consuming the service. As such, the service is not intended for high volume writes. Keep this into account. It is intended for high volume reads. So write as less information as you can, let me say so, write the settings, write the tokens, write what you need, but without continuously writing information, otherwise you will get easily throttled. On the contrary, you can read with high volume requests because that's the purpose of the service. And when you do that, keep into account that you could still get throttled. So let's use some retry logic, which is, by the way, provided out of the box by the SDKs provided by Microsoft itself. When you access the Azure Key Vault, again, you should consider accessing the Azure Key Vault using an app-only model with an X509 certificate rather than using a delegated access token of a specific user. And eventually, you can leverage the Azure Managed Identities for a better security when you access the Azure Key Vault. If you have to build the UI, and usually you have to build the UI of your solution, my advice is try to use Microsoft Teams as much as you can as the container of your UI. So, for example, you can create team tabs as SharePoint Framework web parts. You can create team tabs with the Teams generator, and you can easily extend the UI of Teams, providing the UI of your custom solution within the user experience of Teams. You can also use the out-of-the-box services provided in Microsoft 365, like Power Apps or the adaptive cards. You can eventually use a Logic App or a Power Automate flow together with adaptive cards and Microsoft Teams to host those adaptive cards so that you can easily collect information from users using Teams, which is the by default tool that the users are using nowadays in the Microsoft 365 offering. And if you need to provide a feedback to the users, still you can use Microsoft Teams. You can write a message on a channel. You can write a message in a chat with a bot. You can use the Graph API to write content in Teams. So you can easily build the full round trip of collecting information and providing information back to the users just using Teams as the container of the UI. When you do that, in the backend, you will have some custom application logic. Well, the custom application logic can be based, just to make a few examples, on Power Automate, Azure Logic Apps, or custom code. Again, my personal viewpoint is use Power Automate as a great tool for personal processes and flows. So I'm used to saying that it's a user-centric software as a service offering within the Microsoft 365 offering. It is mainly focused on building processes to manage synchronization, notification, file handling, and stuff like that. It is fully integrated with Microsoft 365, and it has a quite rich set of connectors for external systems as well. But if you want to build a solution which is enterprise level and which is more platform as a service oriented, you should think about using the Azure Logic Apps. The Azure Logic Apps are a better option if you need to integrate with external system like system provided through ADI or business-to-business systems and stuff like that. Moreover, the Azure Logic Apps are at the basis of the Power Automate offering. So it's of course something which is providing almost the same set of functionalities, but with a different approach, with the capability, for example, to design your flows in Logic Apps using Visual Studio. And it is more process-centric and more enterprise level if you need to build business processes rather than user-centric processes. That's my opinion. Of course, there are scenarios in which you need to build a custom code as well. And if that is the case, if you need to do something which is uncommon, which cannot be easily done using Power Automate or Azure Logic Apps, well, we are developers. Here we can develop, we can write custom code. But mind the hidden cost of management and maintenance of any custom code-based solution that you build. Regardless the choice you will make, whether you will use Power Automate or Logic Apps or custom code or whatever else, Microsoft Graph will be your master key. So whenever you build a solution, keep into account that you will have to use and rely on Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph provides you all of the APIs that you can use to access the main resources available through Microsoft 365, like users, teams, messages in a mailbox, team channels, planner, and stuff like that. So Microsoft Graph, as I said, is your master key to access all of the objects, all of the resources, and all of the workloads that you have in Microsoft 365. And that's why I said before that you should always register your solution as an application in Azure Active Directory, because registering your application in Azure Active Directory, you will be able to access Microsoft Graph in the backend using either a delegated access token or an application-only access token. But you will need to register first the application in Azure Active Directory. Whenever you use the Microsoft Graph, keep into account that you should try to do your best to use the V1 endpoint of Graph, because this one is the released one. There is also the beta endpoint. If you really need, you can use that one, but at your own risk, because the interfaces of a beta endpoint could change, and Microsoft is totally allowed to do that because you are using a beta endpoint which is not fully released, fully stable. But every now and then there are functionalities that you really need to use from the beta endpoint. Just be careful and keep an eye on the interfaces to see if there are any upcoming changes. There is also a nice change log page available on the Graph, which will help you figure out if there are any upcoming changes in the interfaces of the Microsoft Graph. So, you define the security infrastructure, you made your choices based on the code base or not code based, using Power Automate, using Logic Apps, so on as well. And you now need to host your solution somewhere. What are the available options? Well, when you want to host a solution, one very good option, of course, is to use Azure and Azure Web Apps. And I will explain you why briefly in the upcoming slides. You can also consider nowadays using an Azure Static Web with a CDN, a content delivery network, if you are providing just static content like JavaScript code, CSS code, and stuff like that. Using an Azure App Service will make your life easier because in an Azure App Service, you can easily automate the deployment processes, the deployment slots. You can easily configure the authentication and the integration with Azure Active Directory. So it's the best option, in my opinion, host some custom code which will be provided to the end user with an Azure Active Directory authentication and authorization layer in front of your application. You can also leverage Azure Web Jobs or Azure Functions, which under the cover use the Azure App Service model, so that you can share the same hosting model across all of your custom developed solutions. That said, what can we do if we want to have multiple environments and we want to leverage the Azure hosting options? Well, let's say that you want to have a dev, a staging, a test, and a production environment. With an Azure App Service, you can easily do that, and you can easily define multiple environments. In fact, in Azure App Services, you can define multiple deployment slots, which are really powerful because every single deployment slot is an independent deployment slot, even if you can share some settings across all of the slots, if you like, or you can have just dedicated settings for every single slot. So you can have the dev, the test, and the staging environments having different settings compared with production, for example, but still with some shared setting across all of them. Moreover, you can, for example, play with your upcoming releases of a solution, for example, publishing a solution which is in staging just for the 30% of your users and keeping the production environment for the remaining 70% of the user. Or you can define the percentage, of course. So you can gradually release a new version of a solution using the deployment slots, or you can easily swap between one deployment slot and another, so that when you are ready to swap from staging to production, you just need to click a button and there will be a warm swap between the deployment slots. And really important information, all of this stuff can be done with a unique budget because you will pay for the Azure App Service and not for every single deployment slot. Usually and personally, I always use the deployment slots whenever I have to do hosting of multiple environments for my solutions. However, we are talking about solutions for Microsoft 365. And in Microsoft 365, we not only have the deployment of solutions from a custom developed solution point of view, but we also have services running in the Microsoft 365 offering. So a question that customers ask me very often is, how many tenants should we create whenever we want to build a solution on top of Microsoft 365? Should we have a tenant for every single environment, or should we have a unique tenant for all of the environments? Well, sorry about that, but as usual, or like always, the answer is it depends. But for sure, I create a dev tenant. I usually create a dev tenant where I develop the solution. It's free. You can easily create a developer tenant if you go to the URL that you see on this slide. And as long as you use the developer tenant, you will be able to keep your tenant running and working. So that's a very good option provided for free by Microsoft. Of course, if you will stop developing solution, if you will stop using your developer tenant, if I'm not mistaken, after 90 days, the developer tenant will expire if you will not use it for up to 90 days. It's up to you. But what about test, staging, and production? Well, my advice is that you should try to do your best to use a unique tenant for test, staging, and production. In fact, if you use a unique tenant, you can share the same users, the same Azure Active Directory, the same, if you have one, the same synchronization and federation infrastructure for your user accounts, and the same permissions. So your life will be easier from a maintenance point of view. You can share the same taxonomy if your solution is using a taxonomy in SharePoint Online. You can share the same application registration in Azure Active Directory, or eventually you can register multiple applications for test, staging, and production within the same Azure Active Directory tenant. if you need to test solutions like SharePoint Framework solutions, team solution built on SPFX and stuff like that, you can also leverage the capability to use a site collection app catalog so that you can have the main tenant-wide app catalog for the production released solutions. And you can have site collections and teams to test in a local environment, in a local app catalog, your new versions of the projects you're working on or something that you are going to update without having the need to have a new tenant. However, there are scenarios in which a new tenant, a dedicated tenant for every single environment is really needed. For example, if you are building a solution which will read and write the taxonomy, okay, if you just read the taxonomy, you can use the one shared across all of the environments in a unique tenant. But if you need to write the taxonomy, you need to test functionalities to write the taxonomy, of course, you cannot write the production taxonomy, or you will scramble things for your end users. So, as such, you will need to have a dedicated tenant. Another scenario in which you will need a dedicated tenant for test, staging, and production is when you want to create a solution which will provision users or resources or allocate licenses on the tenant. And as such, again, you can't do that in the production environment while you are testing the solution. And as such, you will need a test and staging tenant isolated from the production one. One more scenario is if your solution is configuring stuff at tenant level. So for example, you are building custom site designs or you are building custom templates that you want to share across the whole tenant. Well, you can't do that for testing purposes in the production tenant, or again, your users will be lost. You will give misleading information to the end user, and as such, you will need to create a dedicated tenant for testing such kind of scenarios. What about storing content? Well, most of the solutions require one or more content repositories in the backend. Well, if you just need to store documents without any metadata, without any custom information, my advice is try to use OneDrive for Business for storing those files. And this is an interesting use case that I want to share with you. You can consider using OneDrive for Business and the personal store in OneDrive for Business to store user settings for a solution. So for example, if you need a JSON configuration file or something to store personal settings for a user, why not using a file stored in the OneDrive for Business personal folder of the user? As such, the user will find exactly the same settings across all of his or her environments, just because they are using OneDrive for Business to store those informations. I think that's a good use case. But if you need to store documents with metadata, as such, you will need something more than OneDrive. You can consider using SharePoint Online and the document library in a site collection of SharePoint Online. If that is the case, you should carefully design and define fields, content types, and libraries for your solution. In my opinion, you should avoid using the Content Type Hub, which is a service which I personally don't like very much. And I think that in the future, we will need to rely on something else than to the old school Content Type Hub. You can consider using, for example, the PnP provisioning engine to synchronize content types, fields, and list definitions across multiple site collections and to keep them up to date whenever you want to release an update. So a good model is define your information architecture, define a PnP provisioning template, and keep the information architecture in sync across multiple site collections using the provisioning engine running in a job or in a backend function. If you need to store information or documents which will need to be long-term documents from a life cycle point of view, well, a good information architecture in SharePoint Online is always the best choice, in my opinion. If you need to also store information which is more like public content for web pages or stuff like that, if you are not using SharePoint Online as the front end, because if you are using SharePoint Online, again, SharePoint Online is the best choice to store that kind of information, like using a communication site, for example, or a team site with a modern client-side page. But if you need to provide UI content through a web-based application hosted on an Azure web app and still related on a Microsoft 365 solution, you should consider using GitHub, for example, because GitHub is a very good candidate for storing content and documents. I mean, web-oriented content through an MD file, for example, and you can use issues, commit, pull request, all the stuff that you have in GitHub. You can make it available to external editors of content, and you can easily read that content uses the REST APIs provided by GitHub. What about monitoring and telemetry? Well, if you want to do monitoring and telemetry, Azure Application Insights is your friend, because with Azure Application Insight, you can easily keep track of performances, issues, exceptions, the request flow of users, and any custom events of your choice. So that's the best choice whenever you want to store monitoring and telemetry information. Moreover, if you want to do high-level logging of information, you should consider using an Azure SQL database for relational and symmetric data, or again, Azure Cosmos DB if you want to store asymmetric data with a NoSQL data logging approach. Regardless what will be your choice, you can consider using Power BI to create powerful dashboards on top of these telemetry and data. Don't underestimate the power of having good dashboards built on top of your telemetry so that you can measure the performance and the efficiency of your solution. From a maintainability point of view, try to always define the architecture of a solution, thinking about maintainability first and not at the end of the solution. So don't think about maintenance as a side effect, but think about maintenance as a requirement of your solution. And as such, again, think about the architecture carefully. So, for example, if you need to do warm updates, use the Azure Service Bus and not the Azure Blob Storage Queue. Use the Azure App Services for having the deployment slots in order to being able to easily switch from one deployment slot to another. And think about using, if you need to have a relational persistent storage, Entity Framework and not only a SQL database repository, because with Entity Framework and with data migrations, you can easily upgrade on the go your data structures, reducing or having a zero downtime when you upgrade your solution. Try to use a development system through Azure DevOps or GitHub, which will make it possible for you to easily roll back any change and to track all of the changes that you make to code so that you can easily maintain your solution also from a code base point of view. So that said, and let me switch briefly the last few minutes of this session to show you the architecture that we defined for the SharePoint Lookbook site. SharePoint Lookbook site, let me show you the site first, is a site that maybe you know, maybe not, but it's a really powerful site that you can use to provision in your own tenant a SharePoint Online site collection based on a set of out-of-the-box available templates. Here you have a bunch of predefined designs, like for example, the Fly Safe Conference, which is one of my favorites. You can choose a template. You can see how the template looks like. You can see what are the features, what are the web parts included in the solution. And if you like it, you will simply click on the Add to your tenant button, and there will be an Azure Active Directory registered solution, which will give you the capability to provision that site collection in your own tenant so that you will be able to have it in your own tenant and to play with it in your own tenant. You will have to provide some information, and by clicking on the provision button, a backend infrastructure will do the actual provisioning for you. So how is the architecture of this solution that I'm talking about? Well, there is a web front end, which is hosted on Azure. It's an Azure website hosted in Azure App Service, built with .NET Core in the front end and with some ASP.NET MVC in the middle, because there we are still using CSOM, and as such we need the .NET Framework and we cannot use .NET Core yet. The site is targeting tenant admins so far, so you need to be a tenant admin. You will connect to the site, and we will use Azure Active Directory because the application is registered in Azure Active Directory, of course. We get through the open authorization flow an access token and a refresh token of the user. We use the Azure Key Vault to store, temporarily store the refresh token of the user, so that we can then enqueue through the service bus queue model a request to provision a provisioning template onto the target tenant. And on the other side of the queue, there will be a web job which will dequeue the message from the service bus, will connect to the Azure Key Vault to retrieve the safely stored refresh token, and will use that refresh token to get a new access token to work on behalf of the user connected at the front end level. By doing that, we are able to do the actual provisioning of all of the resources, artifacts, and stuff that we need to provision on the target Microsoft 365 environment. And as soon as we are ready, as soon as we have fully provisioned all the artifacts, we can get rid of the refresh token, and as such, we recycle it with an automatic expire policy and with a job that we will do the cleanup. We keep into account the telemetry using application insights, and we use it to keep information about the front end as well as about the back end in a unique application insight instance, so that we can aggregate all of the telemetry and monitoring information in a unique place. And we decided to use GitHub as the repository for the content, both for the front end, so the marketing people can update the content of the template that we provide using GitHub and updating documents in GitHub, and we will use the GitHub APIs to read those content, as well as we use GitHub also as the repository for the provisioning template that we use in the backend web job whenever we do the actual provisioning. So this is quite a complex architecture, which is built on top of Microsoft 365, which allows us to do automated provisioning of content and resources in Microsoft 365, leveraging Azure and a bunch of services in Azure together with Microsoft Graph, the SharePoint REST APIs, and the Microsoft 365 workloads. So exactly what I have been talking about in the last 50 minutes. That's all for me. I want to thank you for joining me in this session. Here you can find one more time my Twitter ID if you want to follow me on Twitter. You can also find a link to my YouTube channel, the PSC Tech Bytes, where I publish on a weekly basis technical videos about how to develop solutions for Microsoft 365, and my email address in case you want to reach out and ask me further information about the topics I'm covering. So thank you again. Remember to provide us your feedback. On the left, the feedback for the session. On the right, the feedback for the whole happening, for the whole event. Thank you again. I hope you enjoyed. And let me see if there are any open questions in the Q&A area.